Hi, Rosenna. Are you on? Oh, I had you muted, unfortunately. There you are. Hi there. How are you? I'm having a little trouble hearing you. Can you? Yeah, I can hear you, but I can't understand anything. It's really, really low. So wherever your microphone is, could you try to move it just a little bit closer? Hi, and welcome to the webinar. I'm hoping that folks out there who have logged on can hear me. If you can, please use the raise hand function on your dashboard to raise your hand and let me know that you can hear us. Great. Okay, perfect. We're going to get started in just a few moments. We're just waiting for a few more people to sign on, and as it's the lunch hour, we like to give people a moment to grab their food and sit down, and then we'll get started with this excellent presentation. You know what, Rosenna, I think the email that went out today said that the webinar starts at 1.
Yeah.
And here we are, and it's noon. Okay, so probably it's going to start at 1, not at noon. Okay, that's good to know. This is what happens when we start a training person. Okay, so let's meet back here at 1 o'clock. You can go ahead and sign out. So for those of you on the webinar today, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. We had a little bit of a technical snafu earlier, and we tried to start at noon today. So thank you, Susie, for reminding us that the webinar started at 1 o'clock. So here we all are again at 1 o'clock and ready to get started. My name is Amy. I'm with Violence Free Colorado, formerly Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I'm excited to have with us today Rosenna Bakari. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Rosenna.
Rosenna, thank you. Rosenna Bakari, who's going to be speaking with us, and I'm going to let her introduce herself to you all. I also want to let you know that as we move through the webinar today, we have some poll questions we're going to ask you to answer, and you'll have to just bear with us. This is the first time we've used some polls that have multiple questions, so we're hoping that it goes well and you all will be our poll guinea pigs, as it were. So thank you for your patience with us. Also, as we go through today, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I'm happy to unmute you, and you can speak directly with our speaker today, or feel free to type a question into the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on that and be able to ask Rosenna as we go along.
I lost you for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry?
Can you hear me? My computer's doing something funky. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you, and I can still see you and your screen.
Okay.
But go ahead and feel free to put those into the chat box, and I'll be sure to ask those questions. I already actually did receive a question via email, but I'll make sure that as we get started, I'll bring up and ask Rosenna to address for us. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and hand over the microphone. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Again, I am Dr. Rosenna Bakari, and I'm the Executive Director of Talking Trees, which is an empowerment organization for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse and incest. So I also am a visiting professor, assistant professor at the University of Northern Colorado in Colorado Springs. But my primary responsibility is being an advocate for adult survivors, which I began to do in 2010 when I started living openly as an incest survivor. So you'll hear me mention a little bit more about that as we enter into our presentation. But so should we get started?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the purpose and the goals over the next few minutes. What I really want to do is put you in a mindset where you're willing to reconsider how we approach advocacy. And I'm going to talk about some issues that I think might be a little bit different than what you're used to hearing people talk about advocacy. And so it may be that some alerts and alarms may go off for you as we cover some of the material, because it may sound different than the ways in which you're used to hearing us talk about advocacy. That's a good thing. That's exactly what I hope will happen at some point, is that something will be like, oh, we don't do this, or this is so far removed from what I thought advocacy would look like, because that's where the dialogue really begins. So we'll get into some of that. I want you to leave here with a little better understanding of what it means to live openly as a survivor, and to use that model for your work, your advocacy work. And hopefully, by the end of it, you'll become a more well-rounded advocate. So why am I all in? A little bit more about myself. Again, Talking Trees is an empowerment organization for adult survivors. When I began living openly in 2010, it wasn't that I woke up one morning and go, oh, I think I'll just start living openly as a survivor. When that decision came to me, it was because I saw it almost as a last resort, that if I didn't begin to address these issues of childhood trauma, that my life would never be what I wanted it to be. And that was an epiphany for me. And so as I began to look at the research on adult survivors, it was clear to me that I was one out of 45 million survivors at that time. That number is much greater now. That was living in silence. And so I began this sort of journey of trying to understand, like, why is this happening? And certainly saw the need for other survivors to live openly as a healing resource, and to get rid of the shame. So in this past April, I finally, after doing the work for almost a decade, launched my memoir, Too Much Love Is Not Enough, because I really wanted to continue to share with the world what it looks like when people live in silence. It's not a quiet space for people. Along with that, along with the memoir, I created or initiated a We2 mission. And the part of the We2 mission really was sort of meant to be a response to the Me Too movement. And I mean the Me Too movement as it was publicized, not necessarily as the original intent, because the original intent of the Me Too movement, as we probably know, got a bit removed from what the media presents as the Me Too movement. So one of the things that was happening was that all of these survivors were coming out of the closet, but basically had nowhere to go. Like, what do you do after you say Me Too? Meanwhile, Talking Trees had been doing the work of helping survivors live openly for a long time, and what I hope was certainly a much more responsive way than just asking people to identify and giving them no resources to heal once that identification takes place. So so I launched the We2 mission along with the memoir. And the We2 stands for one survivor plus one listener equals an opportunity for healing. Because people don't change, or the world doesn't change just because people start speaking. Things begin to change when people start listening. And so we can't have movements in the absence of listeners. And so the We2 mission is about creating listeners for survivors, not just asking survivors to identify. So we can't keep complimenting survivors for being brave, and we're not doing anything to change the platform in which they're received. So that's what the We2 mission is about. And so I've been doing a lot more work, whereas the first several years of the Talking Trees was focused on survivors, and it still is, but I've added the We2 component because we are in dire need, given our social climate, of making sure that survivors have the support that they need from organizations, from society, as well as from those people in their personal lives. So that's that. And this is just a chart, and I'm going to leave this PowerPoint available. This is just a chart of where we've come as an organization in Talking Trees, and you can see that the We2 mission is sort of our newest platform. Like all the stuff on the right is stuff that we've been engaged in since April. All the stuff on the left is stuff we've been doing since 2010. So I'm all in, and my goal, of course, is to get other people to be all in as well, and really beginning with an attempt to have people understand the living openly model. So there are some assumptions that are not completely different in form, but they're not as popular, certainly, as I think they should be. And so I want to go over.
Rosenna, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but for some reason the slides are not advancing on our end. Are you advancing the slides?
I am. I don't know what to do about that. Can you? So you still just see the first one?
We just see the first one. Could you maybe just end your slideshow and then just go back in maybe and see if that makes a difference?
Okay. Sorry about that.
No, please don't apologize. I'm sure it's I'm sure that the technology is just not being our friend today.
Tell me if you see it now without doing a slideshow. Does that make a difference?
I do see it now. Mm-hmm.
Is it advancing?
Yes.
It is. Okay, I'm going to start the slideshow and see if it still advances.
Yeah, great. And I'll let you know. Thank you so much. Sorry for the interruption.
Can you see that? No, I'm advancing. No, it's not advancing when you're in.
It is.
Okay. Okay. Yep. All right. So you see where it says assumptions of the living openly model. That's where you are.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So there are some assumptions of the living openly model that are not new. In a big scheme of psychology, that's for sure, but they're also not the most suggested ways of advocating, whether you're advocating as a social worker or a therapist or some other kind of way in a helping profession. We don't always advocate from a position of health, but from a position of illness. So hopefully you'll be able to hear some of those differences that I think are different. So with the living openly model, we can move from the wounded healer to the healing healer. So we know from research that a lot of people that go into these helping professions on any level tend to be people who have experienced some level of trauma in their own background. But the way that we train and educate people is not always, ironically, conducive to healing. And so we try to train people in a way that allow them to be advocates and healers without requiring them to be healers of their own pain. And so the living openly model invites people to be healing healers instead of wounded healers. Because we take away this notion of perfection and this notion of how things are supposed to be, and we instill instead an opportunity or call for people to live from their truth. And we don't want people asking that of those who we serve, and we don't have that or haven't adopted that in our own lives. So that's probably a little bit different. Also, the work is with survivors, not victims. So, when I still hear people use that term a lot, when we talk about people who have experienced trauma in their lives, we often refer to them as victims. Because the Living Openly model is about resilience, we don't label people as victims. So we advocate for survivors. We don't advocate for victims, because if they're talking to you, they've already created some resources for themselves to survive. No matter how that may look on your end, they have already accumulated some resources. It's a work of advocacy. And the therapy or the advocacy is a shared power relationship. So I know the way that our training goes is often one of hierarchy, right? Like, we sit above the person that we're helping, and we have to pretend like we have it all together, or that the health only goes one direction. And in the Living Openly model, the focus, of course, should be on the client, but not in a way that puts us in a position of hierarchy, right? So there's a shared power, not this assumption that therapy or advocacy is something that you do to a person. Instead, it's something that you do with a human being, okay? The role is to create safe space for healing to arise. The role is not to fix a person, but to create the space and trust that people come with their own resources, internal resources. So we talked about resiliency being the base and not the deficit of what people are coming with. Thriving is better than surviving. So we're not trying to just help people survive. We're trying to actually help people survive. Trying to help people thrive. And then facilitation of growth is the goal, not being a secret keeper. This is huge, because as I talk with many survivors on a regular basis, one of the things that happens is that they tell me they've been in therapy for years and years and years and years and years. And I often get that what they get in sometimes just a matter of months moves them further than what they've gotten from other helping people in their life, professional helpers in their lives. And in part, that's because no one has ever challenged them to live openly. So what has happened is that advocacy or therapy becomes a place where they keep their secrets, right? Almost like a priest instead of like a helper. And so no one ever challenges them to live beyond the secrets. And so not as much growth is facilitated. And then just remembering that the goal is catch and release. So when people tell me that, if they've been in therapy, when people tell me they've been in therapy for 20 years or 10 years nonstop, it makes me wonder what the goal of therapy is for them. And so in a Living Openly model, because we're always trying to build on the person's resilience, the goal should be to work yourself out of a job, right? And that's kind of hard for people to think about. So it's like a catch and release. So our goal is to try and catch people who need our support and then release them back lovingly so that they can continue to build on their resilience, not to build this permanent life of dependence on any particular system. Right. So what are some of the nuances of incest or childhood sexual abuse? Now, I do want you to take a look at this square over here, because what has happened generally is that we deal a lot with children who are victims of sexual abuse or trauma. We deal with them immediately, and we know the value and importance of that because we're trying to prevent further harm. We also have plenty of services, albeit not enough, but we have some services for adults who are victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. So we understand the importance of having some immediate response to those situations. But what has happened is that adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse and trauma often is ignored. And so we don't have these services, and we don't think about the nuances just because it happened 20 years ago or 10 years ago or 40 years ago does not mean that there's an absence of trauma or absence of pain. We don't outgrow trauma. And the current model of helping that we use assumes that people outgrow trauma, that once you become an adult, then you're just kind of on your own. Even though we know that there's such a high correlation between issues like domestic violence and addiction, we still will address those, but we never go back and address the childhood trauma that may be the biggest contribution to those adult experiences. So understanding what some of the nuances are, one that's really important is that there's no baseline for normal when you're an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse. Keep in mind that there's no baseline for normal. So if I'm an adult and something horrible happens to me, I'm a freshman in college and I'm sexually assaulted at a party, or I'm an adult in a work environment and I'm sexually assaulted on a date of a coworker. Those horrible things happen and they are indeed traumatic. So by no means is it a comparison or trying to minimize when adult trauma happens. So it's not a degree of the trauma, it's a degree of how do you get back to where you're supposed to be. So if I'm an adult and assuming that things have gone well up until then, I know where I'm supposed to get back to. I know what life is supposed to look like. I know what it's supposed to feel like to be normal, whatever that has felt like. If I have been violated as a child, things have been going, things went wrong so early that I really don't have an idea of what this so-called normal thing looks like. I don't know when I'm doing it. I don't know what I'm supposed to get back to. So even as people say things like leave it in the past, move on, like what does that mean to someone who's never had life without trauma, never had an opportunity to develop into personhood and know what normal feels like? So that is huge. The brain is often underdeveloped in that instance. And so you don't know that. No one tells you that as you're getting older, right? So there's some problems there. There are no safe boundaries and there's constant pressure constant exposure to the trauma because you have not lived life without that trauma. And often there's an ongoing relationship with the violator as well. Huge, one of the few crimes in which that actually happens, because so many adult survivors are actually incest survivors. There is no safe space in our world. There's no space that feels safe because you know that the person who can harm you has access to you. And so that's what creates some of the profound trauma that adult survivors carry with them. Unlike when we're dealing with, like I said, other situations and circumstances where people may be able to get away, or they may have some sense of normal, they may have different resources that are not quite readily available to adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse and incest. Here is your quick quiz questions. So I'm going to give you about 1 minute to just read through these. It's not meant for you to look them up or Google them. It's just meant for you to kind of go down the list. So as we move forward in this discussion about adult survivors, that we know that we're talking from a similar context. Okay, so I'll give you a second to answer those. So and
I think we might have these in the form of a poll. Do you want to give it a try?
Yes, you can. So either way, yes. Well, the poll is, I think, is the score, the actual score. So.
Okay.
Oh, you do have them. Oh, that's awesome. Great.
Yeah.
Great.
So I think everybody should now have the poll questions in front of you. If you can just go ahead and pop your answers in, then we can just get a sense.
And meanwhile, you can feed me if anybody's asking you any questions or things I need to know. You can feed that to me, and then I can take a look at that while we give a few seconds to.
Okay. Are participants able to answer the poll questions? Because I'm not seeing that anybody's actually putting the answers in the poll.
If they keep track of the answers, we can move on.
Oh, yep, now folks are doing it. So, okay, like someone, okay. Oh, I see. Thank you, Nissa. Apparently they have to enter the answers all at once. So they can't just go through.
Oh, gotcha.
So
okay, gotcha.
Taking folks just a few minutes to
Gotcha.
answer them all. So, okay, that's really great to know.
Okay,
so thank you all for, again, letting us experiment with that.
Yeah.
I will say that we did get a quick question via email before this started. So I'm just going to go ahead and read that to you, and then you can choose when to answer it. But she wrote that she recently read an article in the New York Times stating that DV survivors, so domestic violence survivors, that are feeling encouraged to speak out about their abuse with the Me Too movement are still stigmatized and feeling shamed. How do you suggest addressing this issue with survivors, and why are domestic violence survivors not viewed in the same way as women speaking up in the Me Too movement?
Gotcha.
So it's something to keep in mind as we're moving through, and I'll actually go ahead while folks are still answering, and Rosenna, I'll send that question to you.
Okay, thanks.
And I'm happy to repeat it.
I got it, thanks.
Okay. So I think most people have responded. Let's just give them like 30 more seconds to finish all those responses. And then I will end the poll and post those results.
Okay, perfect.
So if anybody has some last minute answers, go ahead and get them in. Even if you don't get through all the questions, go ahead and try to just submit the ones you do have. And I am going to end it and share those results. Are you able to see the results?
Yes, I can. Oh, great. Great.
So let me know when you'd like me to stop sharing those and get back to your presentation.
All right, I'm not gonna, I got a sense of it. So we'll go.
Okay, great. There we are then.
Right. So then here is our answers so people can see. And again, it doesn't matter how many you got right per se. It just gives you at least a starting point of understanding where you are in your knowledge about adult survivors and what are the gaps that you can fill in. A couple of them were a little bit tricky with a number like where 65% of females and 40% of males report substance abuse, and that number is reversed. So so sometimes where the numbers are, they were asking for pretty specific data, so you may not have gotten those right. But thanks for playing. We're all still engaged. Okay. So what I really want us to understand is that given the previous slide where you asked the questions, no matter what your score was, hopefully it gave you an idea that there's a problem here when these things occur, that not all good stuff is happening in childhood, right? And that some of these adults are getting to adulthood and carrying this trauma with them. What I really want you to understand is that if you take a look at the dot in the middle of both of these, so what we do in much of our work is we understand the impact on the child victim. If the yellow dot is the trauma, we see how huge that yellow dot is when little children are impacted by that, right? It looks pretty big. What happens is that when we're looking at the impact on big people, the dot looks a little smaller. It looks a lot smaller, right? But here's the thing. The size of these two orange circles are exactly the same. They're the same size. So this is one of those illusion pictures where the dot in the middle looks like different sizes because of the size of the images around it, but it's the same size. And I use this slide to make the point that trauma, the size of the trauma, does not change because people get bigger. It only appears to change. It's the visual illusion of what we can see. But the trauma doesn't change, same size. And so we have to begin to really understand and appreciate and value that we don't outgrow trauma. We don't. In fact, keep in mind that in childhood, only 20%, approximately 20% of childhood victims are, and I mean victims because they're victims then, are actually identified in childhood. The rest of us end up being adult survivors, still living in silence without having any disclosure to anyone for 50% of survivors. So keep in mind that children show an equal amount of resilience as adults do, right? We have this assumption that children are somehow not being more resilient, but the truth is we are as resilient as children as we are as adults, which is why only 20% of children are identified, right? But it doesn't mean that the trauma is not existing. It just means that we're developing some internal resources to deal with that trauma. So let's talk about then the living openly model. So there are 4 components to the living openly model that caps it off, right? There's the campaign for awareness, there's the assessment for CSA, and providing information, and then supporting living openly. I want to interject and hear the answer, or at least my response to the whole question around shame as we begin to deal with the concept of campaigning for childhood sexual abuse and a living open model in general. So when we campaign for awareness, if we're going to engage our clients in a living openly model, we have to be part of that campaign for awareness. If we are only going to talk about childhood sexual abuse when someone is in our presence, when a survivor is in our presence, whether we're talking about CSA or domestic violence, if the only time we ever talk about that is when we're in front of a client, then we're not doing the campaign for awareness. So what we have when we talk about adult trauma, domestic violence, or childhood sexual abuse is we have this shame that we continue around it because, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we often become secret keepers. So we're not doing the advocacy work outside of the office. We're not expressing to people the importance of having these dialogues and discussions around these issues. And so when survivors speak, they speak in silence. They speak alone, or they speak as individuals, and they don't come together because even people who do the work for us or for them aren't really doing the work publicly. So we all are existing under this sort of umbrella of silence, and that becomes really problematic. And so if we're going to build on this living openly model, we all have to be engaged in the campaign for awareness. We all have to be the voice of people when they're not in a room. Part of the problem with that is because so many people in the field are entering the field as quote unquote wounded healers, and so that adds a whole nother layer on the silence because providers or advocates or therapists aren't addressing their own needs for healing in an open way. It's really difficult to do that with clients, right? So when we live openly, everybody gets to have this experience of living openly so that they can heal. So bringing adult survivors into every conversation on prevention is so important. I can't tell you how many rooms I'm in where we're talking about childhood prevention of childhood sexual abuse, and nobody ever wants to make the connection between child sex abuse and adult survivors of sexual abuse, even though 80% of child sex abuse victims will not be identified. But no one is making those connections. So every time there's a conversation about prevention, adult survivors should be in the room. No one can speak better to what works and doesn't work in prevention like adult survivors. The problem is that in the research and in these discussions about prevention, if everybody's hiding, even the adult survivors who are sitting at the table having a discussion, if everybody's still hiding the pain, we create platforms and programs that really do not consider the experiences of the 80% of the people who have not been identified. So most of what we do for prevention is based on a very limited number of survivors or a limited category of survivors, because they have not taken into account the experiences of adult survivors. So one example of that would be the whole idea, that people say now, well, I teach my children to tell me everything. Well, much of those pieces of advice are the same advice pieces that we got when we were children, but we don't say that. So we sit around a table and we listen to people say these things, and so then part of what happens also is the opposite. We begin, well, what happened to us? Well, how come that didn't work for us? Because people are saying that this works, but it didn't work for us, but no one's asking us because no one's engaging adult survivors in this conversation. So making sure that we bring adult survivors into every conversation. Domestic violence, when we have Domestic Violence Awareness Month, where's the conversation around adult survivors? Of course, child sex abuse is part of domestic violence, but we don't identify as that. Never do the two meet. So all of these intertwinings of adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse generally means that adult survivor issues don't get addressed, because we haven't found ways that we come together and identify and squeeze in these spaces of these other categories that we belong in, but we've never been invited into those conversations. So just making sure that as advocates, you're speaking up for survivors. And I always say when they're not in a room, but the truth is they're always in a room. They're just not identified. So, okay. Assessing for a CSA. And when I say talk about assessing for CSA, I'm not a big advocate of this, sort of 12-point assessment, how to identify when you have an adult survivor sitting in front of you. I think the easiest way to assess is just to ask the question. Ask the question. So it's probably easier and feels more clinical if you have this assessment kind of thing where you're trying to determine a level of sexual violation or childhood trauma, like we're taught to do those things, right? But if we keep in mind that one of the primary issues that adult survivors deal with is shame and silence, having this stoic sort of 10-point are you a survivor may not be as effective as simply asking the person, because you're connecting some dots for them. You're following the clues, but that requires some homework on our part. That requires that we're engaged in consistent understandings about adult survivors, so that we know, oh, you've said this, you've said that. Oh, you talk a lot about physical conditions, but you don't really have any specific illnesses or disease. You just talk a lot about pain in your body. I'm wondering if anyone has ever asked you. I'm wondering if you have ever spoken with anyone about these symptoms. Do you know, by the way, that what you say is often related to adult survivors? I'm curious if that has been your experience. It's the fact that no one ever asked the question that helped maintain the silence of adult survivors. If we simply start including the question in conversations and making it a normal discussion for people to have this platform to disclose, then we will begin to see an impact on the silence of adult survivors. If I go into an office, a doctor's office, and they ask me 46 questions about my health, and none of them are related to the possibility of childhood sexual abuse, then apparently that's not an important question, because people ask you important questions. If I go into a therapist's office and they ask me about my relationships with everybody in my family, but they don't ask me about any possible sexual abuse, then that must not be important, because you asked me all of the important questions. So everywhere I go where people say that they care about me as a human being, no one ever asks the question. And so it must not be an important question, or it must be a question that I'm supposed to deal with on my own. So we have to begin to ask questions when we know there's a relationship that may be giving us a clue that something has gone on. And you may not even get a yes the first time, but let's suppose it takes 10 times for the average person to say, average survivor to say, yes, this has been their experience. Then we have to find more ways and more settings to ask the question so that we can get to the 10th question sooner. As it stands now, we don't get to that question until we're in our 40s, right? Or life brings it into our existence. But the more we ask the question, the more times we're invited to disclose, the more likely we are to disclose. So someone has to start asking the questions. So those are just some of the clues as to when it may be an appropriate time to ask the question. Okay. And be aware that there are categories of people who are consistently not identifying as adult survivors who should be, because people don't take into consideration that childhood sexual abuse is 17 and under. Because we call it childhood sexual abuse, people often think that you're talking about elementary school kids or middle school kids. They often don't even believe people when they tell them, yes, within my environment, whoever that caretaker may have been, it began at 2 years old. People don't think of 2-year-olds as being victims of sexual abuse. They are. People don't think of 60-year-olds of being survivors of childhood sexual abuse. They are. If you have had an experience where you are sexually assaulted on a high school date, that makes you an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse once you get to be age 18. But oftentimes people don't count themselves for whatever reason. Well, not for whatever reason, because there's so much silence around it. People look for ways where they don't count themselves. And oftentimes it takes even longer to make those connections in adulthood between what happened in childhood and what's going on for them right now. Making sure that we're providing good information for our clients is really important. And again, you can't do that if you don't have information. So sharing that information is really, really critical. Making sure that people understand, first of all, that their experiences are not unique is really important. Because we live with so much shame, and because we live in a space of silence, we're not having dialogue, then we don't have access to information. So even if you have access to information about adult survivors, sometimes there's this assumption that adult survivors also know this information. Typically, when adult survivors begin to disclose, they don't have information. Only thing they've been dialoguing with is the voices in their head, and they don't say real nice things. So people need to have information. They need to understand that there's almost 60 million adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So they are not weird, strange, unique in their experiences. They are in company with a whole lot of people who are sitting in their experience of silence as well. And it's important for survivors to know that. They also should know that the average survivor has not one or two, but three violators before the age of 18. Again, because these are all things that people are coming into the experience and having so much guilt and shame because there are these assumptions that are counterintuitive, right? So people assume that, well, and as a survivor, like, well, how could this happen to me once, not just once, twice, but three times or more? Who's going to believe that without believing that it's my fault? But the research shows us that with every instance of violation, it increases. It doesn't decrease. It increases the likelihood of further victimization. That's counterintuitive. Survivors don't know that. I think I'm the only one that's dumb enough or gullible enough or whatever enough that I allowed this to happen three times. Like maybe if it only happened once, I thought that it was somebody else's fault. But if this has happened three or four times, by God, it must be me. So having that information and understanding that this is a common experience for survivors is real important to be able to share with them. Letting them know that it's a high correlation between childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, addiction, crime, that so that they can begin to put together some pieces of their lives. Again, the more normal they can feel in their experiences of abnormality, but if they can begin to have this experience that, oh, people actually understand that what happened to me is related to some other things that I didn't even understand. But someone knows something about this. It's not this big nebulous space in my life that I just have to keep going on and pretending doesn't exist because people are telling me things that I didn't even know. So that's real important. Being able to empathize with them through the explanation and knowing that relationships are difficulty, that managing emotions are difficulty, that not having contact with your family, is common, not difficult, that those things are common in the experience of adult survivors. So just being able to validate for them, not trying to fix them, but validating just where they are is so important. Because you're not just saying, oh, I feel sorry for you. You're going like, no, we have research to show what you're experiencing is pretty common, right? And then making sure that you can offer resources. And I say kind of tongue in cheek, good luck with that. The resources that I've listed here are some of our local resources and some in other places in Colorado. But I will tell you that resources are scarce for adult survivors, especially for if you want to find resources that specifically deal with adult survivors, where adult survivors are not squeezed in with adult sexual assault or domestic violence or child abuse, but where people know the nuances of adult survivors, where there are groups that are just for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. They are really rare to find. Unfortunately, what that means is anybody who puts a shingle up for adult survivors may get clients, and they may or may not be prepared to deal with the trauma of adult survivors if they're not aware of what those nuances are, and or they're only trained in traditional therapy, and so they get caught up in some things that may make sense in certain realms or categories of healing and helping, but do not make sense when you're dealing with adult survivors. So making sure that you have your own list of resources that you're constantly adding to. And then supporting survivors, making sure that you're creating safe space for disclosure, and making sure that you believe everything that they say. We know that shame is a component for adult survivors, but I think for people who have not had the experience of childhood sexual abuse, particularly incest, some of the silence is not just about shame. Some of the silence is about the bizarreness of what that experience is. And so especially trying to clarify it for yourself in your mind as an adult, because some of the stuff that has happened in a realm of childhood sexual abuse is literally unbelievable. Like, no one wants to believe it. It's so bizarre, or so inhumane, it's so unkind, it's so out of anybody's concept of what a parent should be like, or what should go on in a family, that it doesn't sound believable when survivors tell you, and we know it doesn't sound believable. So we don't even try to make people believe it. So it's really important that you believe every part of a survivor story, no matter how bizarre it sounds. So making sure that you're supporting them. Making sure that you know how to counter disclose if that is your experience. Even if you're relating to them as a domestic violence survivor or a survivor of one of the other adverse childhood experiences, making sure that you can create space for that in your advocacy relationship with them, or your healing relationship with them. Not in a way that you're trying to trump their trauma with your trauma, and not in a way that you're like, oh, it's okay, that happens to a lot of people and we'll get over it. And certainly not in a way where you impose your healing journey onto them. Not at all. But in a space that simply says it's okay to talk about trauma. It's okay to live openly. That's all your disclosures are meant to do, is let them know that you can lead by example in your attempt to live openly. Not that means you tell everything that happened to them, like, because they obviously are the focus of what that helping profession is. But breaking the mold and believing that I'm up here and they're here, and you're the only one that's ever supposed to disclose that you have problems in this relationship, in this office. So, there's a space for us to lead by example. So, and just making sure that whenever those disclosures happen, that one of the first things that you say to a person is, I'm sorry. Because there's a pretty good chance that no one has ever said that to them. So let people know that this is something that should not have happened, and I'm really sorry that this is part of your experience. Making sure that you're asking about their healing and not about their abuse. They will disclose to you as they want to, what they feel comfortable, what they feel is necessary for them to disclose. You don't need to ask them specific questions about their abuse. Keep in mind, they're not children. You don't have the same list of questions for adult survivors that you have for child victims that you now have to do mandatory reporting on. You're not doing mandatory reporting on adult survivors. So you don't need to ask them those 10 or 12 or 20 questions about the details of the abuse. What's important is that you try and get a sense of what's on their healing journey. Where are they in their healing journey? That's much more important. And then just making sure that you're giving them space to be in whatever space that they're in. So what is this living openly all about? When you talk about living openly as an advocate or a therapist, or helping clients live openly themselves. And I have one sort of very simple, basic definition about what it means to live openly. And my definition is that you drop the secret. Living openly is simply about dropping the secret. It's not a secret anymore. Even survivors don't realize how much energy we put into maintaining this secret. It becomes such a part of life that you don't even realize when you're making up stories in conversations, or making up lies in your own head about what your life is and what it isn't, because you're just simply protecting your secret. It may be something as simple as having to decide what you tell people when you're in this conversation about, and everybody's sitting around laughing, telling jokes about When's the first time they had their first sexual experience? Because sometimes people talk about those things in light ways, right? But that's not a light conversation for a survivor. So I have to make something up. I have to decide quickly, do I not tell about that? Do I just burst in and say, well, you know what happened to me? Because that's not going to happen. Do I just ignore the first and go to the first consensual encounter, assuming that I've had one up to that point? There's a lot there that we do to protect our secret. And so when we talk about dropping the secret, it just means we learn how to live with this experience being an experience, not it being a secret. So the big thing is about what does it mean to live without this secret? And so that's a very individual decision. No one, not an advocate, not a therapist, not a family member, like no one gets to tell a survivor how to drop the secret. It's a process. It's not a one-time thing. So how you begin to drop your secret, maybe with your children, maybe with your significant other, maybe at your job. It may be with a complete stranger. On the Facebook page that I run as a part of the Talking Trees, there are many people come there and disclose for the first time ever, right? So they come and they drop the secret there, and then they work their way back into more and more personal aspects of their lives. So it's a matter of dropping the secret, and not a matter of advertising that you are a survivor. Okay. It's about living openly, but not living exposed. The big thing is that when people come to live openly, that they recognize that does not take away their right to boundaries, which why it goes back to making sure that you're asking questions about healing and not questions about the details of the sexual abuse. So it's about living openly, but it's not about it all feeling like people can ask you anything and you're obligated to answer those questions, right? So here is just a list of questions that you can ask without asking people to expose what they're not ready to expose to you. So you can ask plenty of questions when a person discloses to you that they're an adult survivor without having to cross their boundaries. Ultimately, what's the outcome of that? We remove isolation, and once isolation is removed, then we can begin to ask for help. But if the only conversations you're having is the conversation in your head, people can't ask for help. You can't ask for help for what you're hiding. So removing that isolation so that you can have people challenge the voices in your head, because discussion is now happening, is how we finally begin to heal. And that is it. I think we're probably a little bit over time, and oh no, we're about right on time. So yeah, so that's my Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, if you want to find me or find more information. Some of these interviews are just additional information that you can glean about adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And you are welcome to contact me by phone or email, or let me know what you're thinking or any questions that you have. And then hopefully that left a minute or two for any questions you have now.
Thank you so much. Yes, well, I have not received any yet. We'll certainly allow folks a moment to type a question that they might have in. But while we're doing that, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing this. Really some amazing takeaways, I think, today. And so again, thank you so much for taking the time out of what I know must be your busy schedule to present to our folks around the state. And then also, of course, thank you to everybody who was able to join us today. The only question we've gotten so far is will a recording of the webinar be shared? And yes, we did record it, so we will be able to share a recording of it. And I also just want to mention that our next brown bag on traumatic brain injury and domestic violence is going to be November 13th, as always, at noon. So just want to make sure to put that out there. And then, of course, when participants leave the presentation today, they will receive an evaluation. It's very short. We really hope that you will fill it out and give us feedback so that we have that for our grant reporting, but also that we can share that with our amazing presenter today. Any feedback is super helpful for all of us. So thank you for taking the time to do that when it comes. So we don't have any other questions, I think. But again, right there on the screen, you have Rosenna's information, and you could certainly reach out to her directly if you think of something in the meantime.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you again.
I appreciate you.
And we appreciate you.